Okay, and we're back, sans feline, hopefully for the moment, and we're continuing to talk about the problem of evil. And the next two articles that we have to talk about are by John Mackey and John Hick. I'm going to deal with Mackey's first here. I'm probably going to spend less time talking about this one than I am about any of the other articles, but I would actually encourage those of you in the class to spend more time reading this article because there's a whole lot to it, and I'm just going to be giving you a brief outline here. John Mackey here is arguing. He's arguing to uphold the problem of evil. In other words, that contradiction that any four of the theses can be not all four can be accepted at once, but any three of the four can be held together. And so, in doing that, he talks about what he calls our adequate solutions to the problem of evil, which are either God is not entirely good or God is not omnipotent, evil does not exist, or the fourth option that he puts out is that good is not necessarily opposed to evil. It is another one that he puts out there, and under that he talks about how evil is twisted good, which that's an argument made by the Christian philosopher and theologian C.S. Lewis. Lewis would probably still say that good is opposed to evil, but in terms of identifying evil as a twisted good, that's something that's really consistent with Lewis, specifically in his rather famous book, Mere Christianity. More that Mackey has to say on good not necessarily being opposed to evil is there's those who might say that evil is twisted good, evil is misunderstood harmony, or that partial evil is a universal good. And there's more that can be said about that, but I'll leave you to your reading and pulling that apart. So those are all adequate solutions that Mackey says that can come up to the problem of evil, most of which involve sacrificing one of the four theses that we talked about. Some of the fallacious solutions or inadequate solutions that Mackey talks about, there are those who would say that good cannot exist without evil, evil is necessary as a means to good, and the universe is better with some evil in it than it could be if there were no evil. And then also the claim that evil is due to human free will. And so we go through this, and at the end of the article where Mackey ends up is, for him, it makes the most sense to sacrifice the idea of omnipotence. Although Mackey himself would actually sacrifice the idea of God. Mackey was an atheist, and is really one of the better atheist philosophers out there. So if folks are interested in reading more on the topic of atheism, I would really encourage you all to take a look at John Mackey. He's really one of the better writers and the better thinkers out there. I know there's a lot of stuff in popular literature right now from names like Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens and Sam Harris, and it's wonderful polemic and provocative literature, but I kind of consider those guys to be, in the atheist world, the equivalent to what in kind of the evangelical Christian world is Jerry Falwell and Pat Robertson. You've got these very famous pop writers who speak in these broad, sweeping, black and white terms that everyone is supposed to be either completely for or completely against. Whereas Mackey also writes as a committed atheist, but writes with a little more development in his thought, and writes with some more nuance and subtlety in his arguments, and I think really puts together a much better picture. So for those who are interested in the topic of atheism, I would really highly recommend any of the works by John Mackey. So that's as in-depth on Mackey as I'm going to get right now. And we're going to jump right on over to the article by John Hick, where this is taken from his book, Evil and the God of Love. And here in this book, he looks at the problem of evil, and he sets out kind of an alternative interpretation of the classical Judeo-Christian mythology. First of all, Hick is much more of what one might call a liberal Christian. He writes as a Christian, but he writes as sort of a Christian who tends to break most of the traditional rules that most people associate with Christianity. And that's sometimes identified in some groups as the liberal perspective. It's got nothing to do with arguments like conservative or liberal in the political or partisan sphere. There's no connection to ideas of Democrat, Republican, or capitalist, communist. Completely different. So here we've got Hick offering this alternative interpretation, and he identifies kind of the traditional arguments about Christian mythological presentations, presentations that make use of the story of the Garden of Eden, like Leibniz did. Looking at the story of the Garden of Eden as the story of a perfect world that was then ruined by humanity's sin and plunged into depths of death and sin and destruction. So perfect creation ruined by Adam's rebellion. Hick identifies this particularly with the early Christian theologian St. Augustine of Hippo, and he calls this the Augustinian interpretation. And Hick offers this alternative by pulling from a source that is actually even earlier in Christian thought and Christian theology, and that's the voice of Saint Irenaeus. And in Irenaeus's presentation of the story of the Garden of Eden, creation he conceives of as an ongoing process. In other words, that what we're handed in creation is the raw material for the world, and we're expected to do something with that. And the story of the so-called fall of humanity it's not the ruining of a perfect creation. It's just one more, albeit painful, step in humanity's development as a species, and it fits into the larger picture of what Hick calls soul making. And again, he pulls this from Irenaeus largely, but kind of offers his own spin on that. So when he talks about soul making, he identifies two kinds of life. The first is bios. It's the same Greek word from where we get the term biology. It looks like bios, but it's bios. This is biological life. It's animal life. It's the life that we are all given upon being created, upon being conceived or born. We're granted life, and that is bios. It's the life we're given. And there's another kind of life, also using a Greek word, zoe. Looks like the name Zoe, but it's pronounced zoe. And this is a kind of personal life, a kind of full and rich life that God intends for all people to embrace and to be a part of. But it's something that can't be handed to us in creation in the same way that bios life can be handed to us. This kind of zoe life can only be formed through free will. And it can only be formed if we choose to embrace specifically compassion is one virtue that Hick spends particular time focusing on. So one way that he lays this out is that when you and I look and see our fellow human beings suffering for reasons that are mysterious, reasons that we can't really figure out or understand, then we kind of have this twinge of fear going on inside of us that goes, gee, that could be me. This person is like me. This person who is suffering is a person like me. And so, to quote one of the poets, there but for the grace of God go I. And so we feel this empathy with our suffering fellow humans, and this empathy, this compassion leads us to reach out in acts of compassion. And as we do that, as we reach out in compassion, we become better people. We become fuller people. We move toward that wholeness and that fullness of life that Hick says God intended for people to live in. And so within this concept, Hick makes the statement that if we follow the Augustinian interpretation, then what we end up with is a world where people are kind of pets, and God is a zookeeper. And the zookeeper's job is then to keep the pets in the zoo safe and warm and happy and make sure that nothing bad ever happens to them and that they stay locked up in their nice little cage. Um, and Hick's argument, though, is that this world is actually not meant to be that way. This world is not meant to be a paradise. And Hick uses parental image for God and says God is a father. And he'd say, well, a father's job then, and that's an image that's consistently used for God, especially in Judeo-Christian or the Abrahamic faiths. Hick uses this father image for God and says, well, the father's job as a parent is to raise the children. And so if we are all supposed to be God's children, and God's job is to raise us, well, that's going to involve pain. And you got to go through hard stuff to grow up, and growing up is hard, and it sucks sometimes, but it's just part of the process. And and any parent who kept their kid sheltered and locked up and held them off from having any kind of growing experience in the world, most folks would commonly agree that would be kind of negative parenting skills. And Hick would agree with that. And so according to this, what Hick calls the Irenaean theodicy, this image of God as a parent who is raising children, the supreme value is not pleasure, is not happiness, but the supreme value is actually growth. Are you being put in a situation where you can, if you choose to, grow into more fullness of life, grow from that given life, bios, to that sort of full, chosen life, zoe. So the supreme value is pleasure, not growth. Excuse me, I said that exactly opposite. The supreme value is growth, not pleasure. And one of the things about Hick's theodicy is that it looks to the future to find meaning in suffering. That it doesn't look to the past. It doesn't look to put suffering in the context of, well, suffering happens because people sinned and death is in the world and it's somehow punishment for our sins, or any of the other problems that people experience. It doesn't blame it on sin. Likewise, it just doesn't really agree with Leibniz, who said that it's accomplishing a greater good, so we should just put up with it. Those are all looking to the past to find this kind of meaning, whereas Hick is saying we should be looking to the future, the kind of life that we're meant to move toward. In order to find meaning in suffering, we should look at that Zoe life, the life that's shaped by freely chosen compassion, that can lead us toward becoming better human beings, better people, people that conform, as Hick would say, more to the image and likeness of God. And so that's the question, is who are we becoming? And are we, of our own free will, moving toward the life of Zoe? And that's the statement Hick is trying to make. And I think that's all I'm going to say about that for now. And so it's a little on Mackie and Hick, and hopefully this helps bring some of the ideas and the reading down to earth more, and that this is helpful to you. Alright, so happy reading, happy discussing, and I look forward to reading your papers. Take care.